Welcome, everyone. I'm Yan Long, an assistant professor of sociology at UC Berkeley. Today's event is part of the Culture in Contemporary Life series initiated by the American Sociological Association section on cultural sociology. The purpose of this series is to explore pressing issues of our time through the cultural lens. So I want to first thank my committee members. By the way, I'm super bad with names, so please bear it with me. Amini Gaziani, Ali Kudo Piazza, Rachel Kington, Ian Waller, and Xiaohong Xu. So today we are going to discuss masculinity. As a moderator, I will start with 4 questions for our 4 distinguished panelists. Then we will open the floor for questions from the audience. To participate, you could post your questions and comments in the Q&A section on Zoom anytime, but please do not use the chat room. So for the 3rd panel of the year, I'm so honored to be around of a panel of stellar scholars. Okay, so Dr. Hector Carrillo is a professor of sociology and director of graduate studies and a professor of gender and sexuality studies at Northwestern University. He has 2 books, both of which I love. The Night is Young, Sexuality in Mexico in the Time of AIDS, and The Pathways of Desire, The Sexual Migration of Mexican Gay Men, which received the multiple national awards, including the 2020 ASA Distinguished Scholar Book Award. His current research investigates amateur genealogists' interactions with archival documents and the social implications of the proliferation of genealogy as a global phenomenon. He's also completing research on the sexuality of straight identified men who are sexually interested in both men and women. Dr. Michela Musto is assistant professor of sociology at the University of British Columbia after being a 2021 NAED Spencer Postdoc Fellow. Her areas of expertise include gender, race and ethnicity, education, children and youth, and sports. Michela's award-winning work investigates the context under which schools and extracurricular activities reproduce social inequality, including academically tracked classrooms, youth sports, and other after-school activities. Her current project examines the social construction of exceptionalism in early adolescence. A book project on this same topic is currently under advanced contract with the University of Chicago Press. Dr. Tristan Bridges is the Associate Professor of Feminist Studies at the UC Santa Barbara. His research highlights the relationship between gender, sexuality, and power, with a focus on hybrid configuration of masculinity that operates in ways that both challenge and reproduce systems of inequality. He's currently working on several projects, including a book examining how we theorize about men's relationship with gender identity and equality in the 21st century, another book project on American couples with man caves in their homes, as well as a collaborative project on mass shooting in America. Right now, he's the co-editor of the journal Men and Masculinities. Dr. Robert Wyrod is associate professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies and International Affair Programs at the University of Colorado, Boulder. He's a sociologist interested in gender, sexuality, and social change in the developing world. He's the author of AIDS and Masculinity in the African City, Privilege, Inequality, and the Modern Manhood that received multiple national awards. Funded by NSF, his current project focuses on the rise of China as a new force in African development. This work brings a distinctive ethnographic perspective to how Chinese development is shaping gender relations and the lives of men and women in Africa. Okay, so let me start by going around the room with the first question. So in the countries or regions you study, how the pursuit of and anxieties around masculinity have changed in the past 2 decades? Michela, do you want to go first?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for organizing this. It's really great to be here. And as Jan briefly said at the beginning, my research takes the educational system as its, my current project takes the educational system as its focus. And more than anything else, what I want to emphasize is how much popular debates around masculinity in education haven't changed over the past 2 decades. And let me just briefly back up to contextualize this point. Research consistently shows that girls outperform boys in most areas of school. They average higher grades, higher high school and higher high school graduation rates. And also they are more likely to enroll in and complete college in comparison to men. And girls, when in K through 12 education, also enroll in a greater number of extracurricular activities and complete more honors and advanced placement courses than boys. So as a result of these gendered academic achievement differences that we see going on within the educational system, these statistics have sparked talk of a boy crisis in schools. And pundits and journalists have written books with titles such as Why Boys Fail and The War Against Boys and The End of Men. And as these titles suggest, popular discourses often assume that the traditional gender hierarchy in the educational system is reversed. And now it is often assumed that schools are a feminized space and one in which boys are inherently at a disadvantage in comparison to girls. And to remedy this crisis, many solutions have been proposed. And these have ranged from increasing the number of teachers who are men in schools, or also making sure that the curriculum is focused on activities and subjects that boys are presumably more interested in. And single-sex education has also been proposed as a potential solution to try to ensure that boys don't end up falling too far behind girls. But the book manuscript that I'm currently working on flips this narrative on its head. And I'm not going to go too far into the details of my argument, but what I'm arguing in the book is that these popular anxieties about the boy crisis help deflect attention away from patterns of inequality that are embedded within schools. And in fact, many of these fears can be traced back to the mid to late 1800s. And this was a time in which men's power and authority in the United States and also in the UK was being challenged on multiple fronts. And it was within this context that the educational system that we currently have first emerged. And schools they're part of these broader systems that have been designed to ensure that white men end up having characteristics that we assume that other people don't have. And so one of the things that I'm arguing in my book is that today in schools, because many of these structures have remained largely unchanged, schools are set up in a way that allow white boys to become seen as the most intelligent, confident, and athletic students in school. And you need all of these characteristics in order to be thought of as being, positioned for long-term success. And these same school processes also systematically ensure that girls and boys of color are seen as not having these characteristics. They either have too much of one or not enough of others. And we can see the long-term implications in terms of how this ends up playing out within higher education and the workforce. So contrary to perceptions that there's this boy crisis within schools, men are slightly, if not overrepresented within elite universities. And they also continue to comprise the majority of students who end up going into fields, majoring in fields where natural intelligence is thought of as being really important to one's success. These fields include areas like math or physics or philosophy. And even within feminized jobs and occupations, white men still end up remaining overrepresented in leadership positions or like really high status positions within these areas. So ultimately, what these fears end up doing is deflecting attention away from the processes that are allowing white boys to rise to the top.
I realize I also always love physics, math, and philosophy, and consider them as the smartest. Okay, so Hector, what do you think?
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here too, and thank you, Michela. That's a fascinating set of issues that you're talking about. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction because I think this question gives me an opportunity to talk about the question of change from a transnational perspective. And as you mentioned, Yang, most of my previous work has focused on sexuality and gender in Mexico. But I think some of these comments will probably apply to other parts of the world as well. First, I see it as crucial for us to consider the ways in which many countries, such as Mexico or countries of the so-called global South, more generally, have experienced accelerated processes of progressive change vis-a-vis gender and sexuality over the past few decades. In Mexico, for example, the anthropologist Matthew Gottman detected in the 1990s profound changes in Mexican masculinities, both working in working class and middle class settings. And in his ethnographic work in Mexico City and Oaxaca, he noted that for many young people, the words macho and machismo had shifted meanings. Cis women demanded that cis men change machista ways, and for many Mexican cis men, being called a macho had become an insult. So this is not to say that so-called traditional masculinities have gone away. And in fact, there's now a growing awareness about a local version of the Me Too movement in Mexico. Although change has been very unevenly distributed, it is palpable that at all levels of Mexican culture, it has happened. And I could say the same in relation to Mexican sexualities and shifting attitudes about homosexuality and LGBT identities and lifestyles more generally. In fact, over the past few decades, Mexican society has come to question the view that Mexican gay men are by definition, quote unquote, effeminate. And this changed older systems of classification that suggested that homosexuals are, quote unquote, like women, and that masculine men who participate in same-sex relations are not themselves gay or homosexual. So men who could get away with participating in same-sex relationships and claim to be heterosexual were challenged about their identities and included more and more into the world of gay identities. However, all of these complicated changes, I would say, are in tension with the backlash that has happened from social conservatives and the kinds of authoritarianism that it tends to lead to. Now, I'm going to stop there because I know that your second question is about this topic, so I'll come back to it.
Okay, great. Okay, so Tristan, what's your take on this?
These are hard responses to follow. Thanks so much for having me. I think I'm fascinated by gender and sexual change, and I think that one of the biggest things that I've documented, I've primarily studied the United States, but now as a co-editor of an international interdisciplinary journal, I'm seeing research from all over the world, some of which is like transformations that are happening in the United States, and others of which is really quite distinct. But one thing that that I think is distinct in the last 2 decades, sort of a shift, is related to, I think, something that both Hector and Michela are talking about. It's a finding that I've started calling the "I'm not like most men" finding. And it's popping up everywhere, all around the world. When I first discovered in my dissertation research, I thought, I'm onto something really new. And in fact, I was onto something many other scholars were onto as well. I think when scholarship on masculinity kind of solidified into some sort of recognizable subfield of gender studies, a lot of that work, a lot of the early work was characterized by qualitative research. Raewyn Connell famously stated in the 90s that the field was in what she termed the ethnographic moment. And so we have all these really interesting nuanced portrayals of men's understandings of gender from that period. And when asked about masculinity, like most of the research on men in the United States documented men eager to kind of have a relationship with masculinity, to tell you how masculine they were, or to tell you that they're, you know, just as masculine as most other men. And today, I think that's shifted quite a bit. I don't think that, what this means for systems of inequality, I think, is a different question than that. But when I sit down with groups of men, and I've studied fathers' rights activists and pro-feminist men and bar regulars and men who have man caves in their homes and more. And when I bring up the topic of masculinity, one of the things that I think is most common that I find is men are really eager to distance themselves kind of categorically from the concept. That's new. And what that means, I think, is subject to lots and lots and lots of research, but I do think that's sort of historically distinct. And I also think that's sort of one group. So like Hector is talking about transformations that are happening in Mexican society, and Michael is talking about shifts that are happening in the US. And both are describing also this sort of conservative backlash. And I think that I'm not like most men finding is also accompanied by this like resurgence of people very eager to say, I am masculine, masculinity matters. And I think both of those things, rather than sort of saying which one of those two things is happening, I think a big shift is that both of those things are happening at the same time, and they're happening all around the world. And I think it reflects a sort of a more general trends in political polarization. I'll stop there for now because I don't want to step onto some things that I want to say for other questions.
Okay, it's always great to hear from a discipline sort of perspective. Okay, so Robert, what about you?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. I just wanted to thank everyone who organizes these things. And yeah, it's, as someone who studies sub-Saharan Africa, it's really interesting to hear what everybody had to say. There are these striking similarities, like Michela, like there's so much talk about the girl child getting so much emphasis, especially in education in Africa, and what happened to the boy child. That is a big thing in East Africa. And Hector, like this tension between progressive change and the backlash is something I think a lot about. And as I'll talk about, I feel like there's a lot of backlash tendencies in the part of the world that I'm doing research in. And then Tristan, like I'm not like most men, I feel like I have had several young men in particular in Uganda say almost that exactly. And often they are like most kind of normative men, but yeah, they see themselves as different. So just so interesting to see these connections across the world. So yeah, I just wanted to use my couple minutes here to just talk about, both anxieties around masculinity in sub-Saharan Africa, and I guess also impediments to progressive changes in masculinity that I'm seeing. And just a little disclaimer, I study Uganda and East Africa, so I'm a little leery of making generalizations about this super diverse region. But that said, I do think what's happening in Uganda is indicative of more general trends. They might be happening in kind of more dramatic and pessimistic ways in Uganda, but they're not unique. And so that kind of gives you a sense of, my perspective from Uganda in particular. And I was thinking about the three big issues in my mind, and they're intertwined. And I'll just talk about each one real briefly. I think, the one thing that really sticks out in terms of men's anxieties is heightened economic inequality. The issue of finding good work that pays okay and consistent is a long-running theme in African studies and life in Africa. But it definitely, since I started my research in Uganda 20 years ago, I see this intensifying economic stratification, where there is a small elite that has gotten quite rich. There's almost no middle class to speak of, and then there's everybody else. And so there's a sense that not only is work precarious, but the distance between everybody and the elites has grown larger and larger and larger. And a lot of my research has been in the capital city, and in capital cities in Africa, it's very evident. You see these cores getting kind of gentrified, and people being forced into slum or quasi-slum communities or being pushed to the urban periphery. And so I think for men, this economic inequality heightens this sense of insecurity and anxiety about embodying a key ideal of being the breadwinner for the family. And what's interesting to me is, men talk about this and they're very frustrated, but they often don't focus their frustration on the elites. They often focus it on their peers and especially on women. So this economic inequality, I think, is driving this kind of sense that men are losing out. And then the second issue that's related is that I feel like feminism has become increasingly embattled in sub-Saharan Africa in the last 20 years. There's a real backlash to what were kind of amazing gains in the 1990s. But by the 2000s, you start to see this, backlash rhetoric. And Uganda is a real prime example of this. I'd say up until 2000, they were seen as one of the leaders of women's rights and feminism on the continent. And what I've seen in my 20 years there is increasing government scrutiny of feminists, much more pressure and harassment on feminist organizing, to the extent of even imprisoning from feminist leaders. And so you have the government kind of cracking down on feminism and seeing it as a threat. And then for like ordinary men, the backlash manifests itself in this very familiar zero-sum game mentality, that women's gains come at men's expenses. And so, those dynamics then fuel these regressive forms of masculinity where men are trying to shore up their masculinity, often at the expense of women. And then I think the third dynamic is probably familiar to a lot of folks. In the last 20 years, we've seen not only regressive, but truly repugnant legislation regarding LGBTQ issues in sub-Saharan Africa. And I see them as like efforts to institutionalize homophobia. And Uganda is not alone in this. Nigeria, Malawi also come to mind. And there's a couple of countries that have moved in the opposite direction. But there is this sense of this attempt to kind of institutionalize anti-gay sentiment. And it's part of, promoting a very narrow definition of masculinity. And I see it as simultaneously kind of shoring up heterosexual men's sexual privileges. And so that's, I think those forces all kind of combine to reinforce a really regressive, elite, hegemonic masculinity that's evident in many places in the region. And, and then you layer the economic insecurity on top of that. And, ordinary men feel really inadequate and insecure and hostile to progressive gender change. So that, I guess, is my little kind of pessimistic take on what's happening in the region.
Yeah, well, Robert, you were talking about very similar to my observation of China and East Asia in general. So there are definitely some common themes going on. And you also touch on this topic, which I'm going to transition into the next question, which is to what extent the crises of democracy and the resurgence of authoritarian tendencies are intertwined with this, crisis of an masculinity around the world. Tristan, do you want to go first?
No, I don't, but I will. So the panel title is something like the global crisis in masculinity or something. And actually, this is a topic that masculinity studies scholars have sort of been talking about since this subfield sort of emerged. What is a crisis of masculinity? And if it actually is something, how would we measure it? And does it exist? And the sort of like reigning explanation in the field is that the crisis of masculinity is sort of a flawed discourse, but it's a really powerful discourse, and it's one that gets mobilized a lot, which actually I think came up in everybody's responses in the first question. So the way that masculinity scholars often deal with this is they'll say, to kind of demonstrate that something is in crisis requires first demonstrating that it had some period of stability prior to the crisis, so that it can be shown that stability can be shown to be disrupted in some meaningful way. And the really interesting thing with masculinity is that we sort of lack that in almost every way that we look for. Masculinity is something that sort of has undergone transformation since it was constructed as meaningful. So whether or not masculinity is in crisis, I will say that at least in the United States and lots of other regions around the world, masculinity is often claimed to be in crisis. And there are certain periods where that gets really heightened. So maybe one way of thinking about this is to say that perhaps there are periods of time where masculinities are perceived as less stable than other moments, and that maybe those are moments of stability. So for instance, Michela, in responding to the first question, sort of brought up this transformation in the 18th and 19th centuries surrounding like men's status in society. And that's a moment we have this like massive body of historical work on masculinities that focuses on very short periods of time in US history. And they're periods of time that were kind of characterized by similar discourses. One of my favorite books on this topic is by the historian Gail Biederman. She published this book, Manliness and Civilization. And historians would, if there were a historian here, they would be picking on us because they don't like the word masculinity. Often sociologists will read masculinity back in time as far as it goes, and masculinity is a relatively modern phenomenon. There's these collections of words to refer to sort of men and gender that go back in time that have really different meanings. So for instance, today, I think when we use the term manly, it has this it feels like the same thing as masculine, but it just sounds vintage or something. But in fact, Gail Biederman showed that manliness had a very different meaning in early 20th and late 19th century, and that there was a very small group of men who had access to manly identities. And then it was during that period of time where that group of men lost access to the ease with which they would acquire those identities because of economic transformations. And that's when all of a sudden we switched to talking about masculinity. The big difference between the two is that masculinity was a term that was intended to kind of differentiate all men from women, where manliness was something that got offered to some men. So that's really interesting. I think the other thing that comes up that I think is related to your question is something else that's just sort of a larger, more general finding in historical work on gender, is that transformations in masculinity have tended historically to follow transformations in femininities, which is kind of interesting if you think about masculinities as being associated with power and authority. The historical record kind of suggests that it's masculinity that's getting pushed around by femininity. And what that means, I think, is that those are moments when masculinity feels like it's in crisis because inequality requires distinction and difference. And during moments when distinctions and difference get challenged, if inequalities are going to persist, they need to be reproduced in sort of new ways. And I think, so a lot of the work that I think connects the sort of resurgence of authoritarian tendencies and crises of democracy all around the world is connected with this larger transformation. I'm just finishing up teaching a graduate seminar on masculinities at my university, and we reread Raewyn Connell's Masculinities early on in the course. And there's a quote in the book that I always stop at, and I wrote down because I didn't want to forget, where Raewyn writes that shifts in the global gender order have, quote, resulted clearly enough in a major loss of legitimacy for patriarchy, and different groups of men are now negotiating this loss in really different ways. And I think this is connected to some of what all of us were talking about in the first question, that crisis is still going on, that this is the legitimacy of a system of inequality has been challenged on a global level. And different groups of men and different nations and societies are all reacting to this sort of larger challenge.
Okay, so I guess that's probably a very good sort of transition to, I think, some of Robert's early comments. So do you want to say more about this whole authoritarian, or let's say the political changes in Africa, and how does that shape the process?
Sure, yeah, but first, let me just say, Tristan, that was so interesting. I've thought a lot about this crisis language and get hung up on it, and differentiating crisis from stability versus instability period is really helpful. And it gets us out of that kind of crisis bind, I feel. So thanks for that. And then also just that comment about changes in feminism kind of leading changes in masculinity, and the way you kind of, talked about the relation between it. It's just really, really interesting and helpful. So yeah, thanks. That was great. And I guess I'll just say a little bit about this question, and I'll focus much more on this issue of resurgence of authoritarianism. And I guess my big point would be that absolutely these global trends and kind of authoritarian tendencies are super important in Africa. But I would say the regional trends are equally, if not more important. So let me just say a little bit about what I mean. Absolutely, I've seen Trumpism embolden the most regressive tendencies, and it's, Trump himself is this model for toxic masculinity that's really useful for a lot of African leaders. And, it's not just Trump, Putin more recently has become a model, and much to my dismay, the Ugandan president's son, who is basically being groomed to become the next president, was, I think, maybe the only world leader to publicly support Putin when he invaded. So great, huh? And then, it's not just Western or, Central Asian, right? It's also China is hugely important as a model. China has become deeply involved in Africa in the last 20 years. And, Xi Jinping is just another model of, an authoritarian leader, and his government very much supports authoritarian regimes across the region, including Uganda. So those things really matter, but in sub-Saharan Africa, the regional trends are equally as important. I feel like democracy is very much embattled in many places on the continent, and it's hard to see that because there were a lot of gains. And this is coupled to a very long history of autocratic leaders in the post-colonial period, often due to colonial politics. And once again, Uganda is this prime example of this backsliding from democracy. Up until 2000, it was seen as the darling of the West for its pro-democracy stance. But the current president has been in power for 35 years, which is one of the longest terms ever in Africa. And how does he stay in power? Well, by becoming increasingly autocratic. And he's hostile to civil society, super hostile to political opposition, and he's very hostile to feminists who have a long history of beating some of the leading critics, and they have become his prime targets. There's one who got national attention in the last few years named Stella Nyanzi, who was tortured and imprisoned. And so there's a way that, gender and sexuality, I think, is key to this authoritarian turn in places like Uganda. And it's tied to these, promoting regressive notions of masculinity that are about maximizing men's power and authority at the expense of women and most men as well. So yeah, that's my thoughts about what's happening in the region.
Okay. Hector, what do you think?
Thank you. Well, my answer actually is going to be very consistent with what Robert and Tristan said. And a key point for me in relation to this question is that in Mexico, as in some other countries, we do need to look at both the right and the left to make sense of the kinds of anti-democratic politics that threaten feminism and other progressive movements in regard to gender norms. And that is to say that the resistance to progressive change is linked to both the extreme right and the extreme left sides of the political spectrum within societies that are increasingly polarized. In many countries, I would say that such resistance is now tied to a so-called anti-gender movement that is strongly critical of what it sees as the erosion of family values created by feminism and LGBT rights. And they tend to encapsulate this in the phrase, catch-all phrase, gender ideology. This critique has been promoted throughout the world by transnational religious groups, including Christian groups and Catholic organizations. And this issue has been studied in Mexico by the anthropologist Annie Wilkinson, who we're very fortunate will be a postdoc at Northwestern beginning this coming fall. In Mexico, for instance, the anti-gender, anti-feminism, anti-LGBT movements are aligned in complicated ways with both the Catholic Church and the religious Christian right, but also with the leftist populism of President Manuel López Obrador, who has had a very fraught relationship with feminism and the LGBT movement, in part because he himself is devoutly evangelical, but also because he has inherited a legacy of a kind of old school Marxist impatience with anything other than class-based politics. In other countries, the opposition to feminism is more clearly linked to either the right or the left. That is the case, for instance, in right-wing populist governments such as that of Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duterte in the Philippines, Orbán in Hungary, Putin, who Robert already mentioned, in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, and of course Trump in the USA. However, on the left side of the spectrum, we could also think of Maduro and previously Chavez in Venezuela, and Morales in Bolivia, again due to their alignment with old school leftist politics. So I think that examining how the complexities of right and left-wing politics affect opposition to democratic liberalism and produce the regressive resistances associated with populism and authoritarianism is crucial for us to be able to understand masculinities around the world in this time.
Michela.
So nice being able to go last because a lot of what I want to say has already been said in slightly different ways by everybody else. And I think I'm going to pick up a little bit in relation to where Tristan left off in particular, because going back to what Tristan was saying, I'm not convinced that there is a crisis of masculinity or that what we are seeing in recent years is really all that different in comparison to what we've seen in the past. And like I said, in response to the first question, men and especially white men are overrepresented in jobs, occupations, and fields where intelligence, confidence, and leadership skills are thought of as being really important to the job. And one area where you can see this being especially true is politics. So I did a little bit of Googling this morning. And currently in the United States, there are 9 women who are governors in the across the US. And there have only been 45 women governors total in the entire history of the United States. And 19 states have never elected a woman as governor. So, this is just a little brief window into the durability of these systems that are in place. And this is because of the democratic process itself. It was designed by land-owning white men, and the democratic process was systematically designed to exclude all others from having full citizenship rights. So as a result of this, the systems have definitely changed. I don't want to minimize that and say that things are exactly the same. And I also don't want to take away from all of the really important inroads that have been made in a lot of different fronts by activists and policymakers, social movements, and also all of the scholars who have pointed out a lot of these tendencies in the first place. But the point that I'm trying to make is that when we're talking about fears about the crisis of democracy or the authoritarian tendencies that have emerged in a lot of different countries, we need to contextualize these within the systems. And we still to this day see examples of cis straight white men using the democratic system to shore up and consolidate their power. For example, in the United States, we see regular examples of this, where the democratic process is being used to prevent women, people of color, indigenous peoples, LGBTQ people, immigrants, and people with disabilities from achieving full citizenship rights. And just as a few brief examples of this, we see increased support for anti-trans bathrooms, or attempts at preventing trans youth from having access to gender-affirming care. It's becoming increasingly difficult for women to have access to abortion. States are banning schools from teaching critical race theory. The US continues to turn away refugees from a number of countries, especially people who are fleeing violence in countries like El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And as recent examples show, it's still far too easy to purchase an assault weapon in the United States. So I think that what we need is an actual crisis of democracy. And I'm using this in the way that Raywin Connell talks about crisis tendencies that can emerge within the system. But what we really need to do is really examine a lot of these underlying practices and policies that are part of the democratic process itself. For example, why do we still use the electoral college system? Or maybe we need to rethink the fact that Supreme Court justices don't have term limits. And these are just 2 really quick examples off the top of my head. But I think that unless we really examine the system and recognize the way that the system itself was designed to and continues to benefit those who are the most advantaged by it, we're going to continue to see these broader patterns of inequalities play out.
I love the deconstruction of crisis. And when panelists start to say, hey, the title of the panel is wrong, I always enjoy that. Okay, so the next question is, so what do you think of the utility of intersectionality perspective for the areas in your study? Let's see, Hector, do you want to go first?
Thank you. Yeah, and I do find that the framework of intersectionality is quite helpful in the study of contemporary masculinities. And indeed, I would say that it's pretty crucial to pay attention to the ways in which multiple social variables intersect in creating profound differences in lived experience in the populations that we study. From gender and certainly masculinity and femininity associated with it, to sexuality, to race, to social class, to geographic location, rural versus urban. And for instance, in my analysis for my most recent book, Pathways of Desire, variations in lived experience among my participants were markedly different across those axes of social difference. And the idea here, I think, is not to presume from the outset what are the most relevant identities that we, forms of difference that we need to consider as part of an intersectional account. And for example, in an article that I wrote with Stephen Epstein on immigrant sexual citizenship, we argued that the intersection of sexual identity and immigration status profoundly shape capacities for inclusion and belonging. So there, the intersectional analysis included a variable that is often not considered as part of intersectional analysis, which is immigration status. Finally, I would say that there are two other things that I would consider to be important. And one is to follow the recommendation of Lisa Bowlek to not see the inequalities and forms of oppression that result from intersectional social marginalization as simply additive across social variables, but rather to consider the complex forms of interaction among social identities and differences that lead to very specific experiences of oppression. And the second one is that I think we should consider intersectionality not only in relation to social oppression, but also to think of it as a possibly very helpful tool to analyze social privilege.
Okay, Michela?
Yeah, so I like Hector, I really value the importance of intersectionality within research, and it's something that in my current project, my project is really, going from an intersectional perspective. And one of the reasons why this is really important, if we're thinking about, the crisis of masculinity on this panel, within the educational system, a lot of the talk of the boy crisis in schools, it detracts attention away from the way that we really need to think about students' experiences in schools from an intersectional perspective. Just as I said that certain boys are not doing poorly in school, there are other boys who are disadvantaged by these systems. And when we talk about boys as, like an aggregate group, it can be really difficult to miss like the differences in people's experiences as a result of, like the intersections that their identities are taking place at. For example, in my research, I start from there's a lot of research that shows that, race and class intersect with gender to shape students' academic achievement. And although white and Asian American boys in suburban schools often perform about as well as, if not better than, girls from similar backgrounds, the opposite is often true. So in urban schools, where there tend to be more Black and Latinx students, girls are often the ones who are outperforming boys from similar backgrounds. And to make sense of this, this apparent contradiction that's taking place, my research, for my current project, I'm doing I did ethnographic research and interviews with students in a racially diverse suburban middle school in Los Angeles. And what I'm showing is that the exact same behaviors that students engage in can be perceived very differently by their teachers, depending on their gender, their race, and the academic track that they have been placed into. So, for example, when white boys make comments or speak out of term in honors classes, teachers often see them as being, really like engaged in the class, and they're really intelligent, and they reward a lot of the remarks that they're making. But then when Latinx boys in the school's standard and remedial classes engage in these exact same behaviors, it gets perceived and responded to in a very different way. So rather than rewarding this behavior, educators end up disciplining boys. So boys end up getting placed on these very different trajectories as a result of the way that their behavior is perceived by their teachers. So, it's only if we think about these things from an intersectional perspective that we can begin to make sense of like the more complex processes that are at play.
Okay, Robert, what's your take?
Well, like Michela and Hector, I definitely see intersectionality is absolutely crucial. I couldn't think about doing the research without that perspective. And I just thought I'd say a little bit about like, some of the specifics of that for sub-Saharan Africa from my perspective. So like when I'm thinking about the gender of masculinity, maybe this is obvious, but like sexuality really matters. And, as I said before, especially this kind of institutionalized homophobia, anti-feminism link. I see them as two sides of the same coin, and how anti-gay sentiment is part and parcel of shoring up heterosexual men's sexual privileges. And then for my research, class has been really central and super important, and it's kind of interesting. It's sort of neglected in African studies these days in like this post-Marxist kind of, world. But, to me, I think class differences are also how a lot of men that I've gotten to know articulate their anxieties around masculinity. It's very much about these class inequalities. And then, ethnicity is also very important, I find, in sub-Saharan Africa. And I guess I'm thinking about this in relation to what, someone problematically would call it tribal differences, right? Ethnic group differences. And, I find that ethnicity is always there to be exploited, and tensions are always there to be exploited. And, political corruption and favoritism very much amplify ethnic differences in dangerous ways. And they also amplify these economic inequalities that I talked about. So ethnicity is something I always keep an eye on in relation to masculinity. And then, finally, thinking about how race matters, I just feel like the legacy of colonialism is always present in contemporary Africa. We see what I think are, rightfully called neo-colonial tendencies and big top-down Western development. It's very prevalent in global health. And, now with China playing such a big role, the racialized politics between China and Africa, I think there's some really interesting questions about how they're intertwined with neo-colonial dynamics as well. So yeah, that would be my take from that vantage point.
Okay, Tristan, this time you're the last.
All right. This is a great discussion. I think intersectionality is really vital, and I think it was late to hit scholarship on masculinities, if I'm being honest. I think one of the reasons for that is that masculinity studies has kind of like these boundaries have been erected around this subfield of gender studies that have created a kind of an echo chamber, which makes outside influence of theories and things like this don't always have the immediate influence that we might suspect when looking at like other subfields. We actually, when Kristen Barber and Joseph Nelson and I took over as co-editors of Men and Masculinities, we put intersectionality in the mission of the journal. And it's something that we work with authors on all around the world, sort of trying to take more of an intersectional perspective. There are huge bodies of work that characterize kind of the emergence of this subfield that studied a small group of men with really concentrated collections of privilege and sort of used the data collected from that group as representative of men more generally. And I think today, scholars are starting to kind of challenge that, although it still comes up in all sorts of ways. Like one thing that I've noticed at the journal is that when we receive manuscripts from scholars studying the United States, they often don't say that they're studying the United States. They just talk about their study, but scholars almost anywhere else in the world always say where they're studying. And I think it's a piece of an intersectional perspective that sometimes American scholars miss. I think some of my work is probably, we can critique some of my work for this. So I think it's a really vital perspective. I also think, as Hector said, that I think it's important to sort of remember that gender always matters, but we don't know how it matters or how much it matters. And sometimes different identities and inequalities are actually structuring some of the things that we're seeing. And we fail to appreciate that if we're not looking at this from an intersectional perspective.
Okay, I really love this discussion. Okay, so we have a limited time left. So I'm going to ask all the panelists to just offer a few words on the last question I have. Then we have a little bit of time maybe for the questions from the audience. Okay, so from your perspective, what is missing in the current public or scholarly debate about hegemonic masculinity? Robert, what do you think?
Okay, I'll try to be really fast, but it totally dovetails with what Tristan was saying about how intersectionality came late to masculinity studies. You know, I think it's just very interesting that this concept of hegemonic masculinity is so central to the theory. It's like, I can't think of another subfield that's so dominated by a single concept, hegemonic masculinity. And, you know, ironically, there's been like a lot of conceptual confusion about what it even means in masculinity studies, which is ironic. And I just want to give a shout out to Tristan and his colleagues for developing, you know, this hybrid masculinity idea to really bring dynamism back in. I think there's been some great work. Yu-Chen Yang's 2020 article in sociological theory, like really did a good job of clarifying it. But I don't know, I have a lot of misgivings about the concept. I feel like it's limited fundamentally to me. And it just really almost feels like it implies this single monolithic dominant masculinity that you can't get away from. And then that then leads to like thinking about there being one particular type of man who embodies hegemonic masculinity, you know, globally, the global business titan. So I don't know, personally, I don't really like it that much. I feel like it boxes us in too much. And so here's my thought, like maybe instead of, you know, what we need to develop it more, maybe we need to move away from it as such a central and, you know, like hegemonic concept in masculinity studies. So I'll put that out.
Okay, so Tristan, what do you think?
Sure, I'll try to be brief also. I've written and talked a lot about this concept, and I agree with Robert that it's just so dominant in the field. And I think it has, there's this great sociological essay by Murray Davis that's entitled "That's Interesting," that sort of attempts to kind of like discuss why things get understood as interesting. And one of the things that I think Davis goes into is things get cast as interesting when they are just obscure enough that that they can kind of be utilized in a variety of different ways. And I actually don't think this was intentional on Raewyn Connell's part. Sometimes social theorists get picked on for having concepts and things that are difficult to understand. But I know when I was in grad school in my comprehensive exams, when I first read Raewyn Connell's work, it caused me to like go back and read sexual theory and figure out what it was that she was sort of writing against. And I think at the time, which is still true today in different sort of theoretical work, you know, she was attempting to produce language to write about and study things that we lacked language to talk about. And I think that's just really, really challenging. And I think that accounts for some of why there's sort of definitional diversity, even within Raewyn's work. One of the things that I think gets missed is, so in popular debates, the concept gets really flattened, that hegemonic, I think it's, you know, it's a good concept because it just sounds sexy. So it's like a concept that just sounds interesting. But in popular debates, I think hegemonic gets treated as an adjective like dominant or popular. And that creeps into academic research too. In fact, it may have been scholars who helped popular debates rely on it that way. And when we do that, we miss, I think, some of the most important properties of hegemonic masculinity is that it's much less important for Raewyn Connell what hegemonic masculinity looks like than what it accomplishes. And lots of popular debates that sort of, and scholarly debates that sometimes characterize hegemonic masculinity, I think miss that dynamism that's present in the concept. So I'll stop there. I could talk a long time about this.
Okay, Michela.
So when I was thinking about an answer for this question, I was thinking about how years back I attended a session at ASA. I think Tristan organized it. And the session was like designed to bring together people who don't consider themselves to be masculinity scholars, but who all study masculinities in some way, shape, or form. And I remember like sitting in the audience, and you know that really resonated with me because I've never really thought of myself as a masculinity scholar, even though I'm a huge fan of Raymond Connell's work and use the concept of hegemonic masculinity throughout most of the what I've done. So I think for me, and this is going off of some of the more recent attempts to clarify, what hegemonic masculinity is or isn't, and a lot of this work has been done by, Jim Messerschmidt, Mimi Shippers, Laura Hamilton and her colleagues had the recent article that brings Patricia Hill Collins's concept of the matrix of domination back into the theorizing around masculinities and femininities. But for me, what's always really important, and this is something where I also think that we can really benefit from culture scholars and cultural sociologists. These meanings and what it means to be masculine or feminine, they get negotiated in everyday life and often are a part of what is happening in settings, and these meanings are not necessarily static. So we have to look at the relationship both between different types of masculinities, but also masculinity and femininity. And what's really important is looking at how people's interactions either are or aren't reproducing this hierarchical and complementary relationship between the genders. And if I'm trying to think about what this might say to public debates, I think that the phrase toxic masculinity is an area where more nuance is needed. And this, of course, it's really catchy, so it makes sense that it has caught on, and it's a concept that now has legs and gets used on social media and things like that all the time. And it's really great because I think it gives people a language to talk about a lot of behaviors that are problematic. But at the same time, and I think this goes back to what Tristan was saying in the very first response, it also then people can then distance themselves from what is perceived as being toxic without actually thinking about the more subtle ways that people are either benefiting from or being disadvantaged by these relations that we are encountering within everyday life.
Okay, Hector, what's your thought?
Thank you, Jan. I want to bring back the article that Robert mentioned by Yushen Yang, because it really made a big impression on me. And I think one thing that I really like about this article, and Yushen is a graduate, a doctoral student at the University of Chicago. But one thing I really liked is the way in which Yushen goes back to the roots of the word hegemony and examines Gramsci's formulation of hegemony, and then links it to Bourdieu and Connell. And one quote that I really wanted to read from it is that he incites us to and I quote, treat hegemonic masculinity not as something to abolish, but as something to take over. And there's a lot of potential there, I think. He also invites us not to see hegemonic masculinity as something static, and to consider the possibility that progressive, pro-feminist, inclusive, non-heterosexist forms of masculinity could possibly be made hegemonic. And in this view, I think part of the task is, and I quote, Yang again, is to examine the conditions under which one masculinity rather than another becomes hegemonic. So what I like about these articles and its arguments is that they're not only hopeful and optimistic, but they also provide us a possible pathway to think about how to respond to the currently perceived crisis of masculinity that we've been talking about for the last hour.
Okay, so since we're really running out of time, so I'm sorry that we're not gonna be able to address all the questions posted in Q&A, but there is one question I'd like to get some comments on. Okay, so could you speak a little bit about the relationship between this purported crisis of masculinity and the parallel crisis of the institution of heterosexuality, which has also been identified by across different contexts? So please just unmute yourself and jump in.
I would say that it's impossible to separate the two, and that we really do need to pay attention at the same time to this so-called to this crisis of masculinity, to the way that critical heterosexuality studies has been doing, because a lot of it relates precisely to the kinds of dynamics that happen that we already discussed throughout this hour.
Others?
I can say something. I think one way of thinking about them both as connected is that I think both heterosexual privilege and gender privilege, like when these were first written about, got written about as invisible. And in fact, privilege more generally was written about as invisible when it emerged to write about all sorts of different identities, from whiteness to masculinity to heterosexuality. I think one thing that we're seeing is that privilege is less invisible than it used to be. And I think that may have been a political project of early scholarship on the topic. We couldn't have known quite what would have happened once privilege became more visible. But I think part of what we're seeing is reactions to that across a number of different identities, that it doesn't change the fact that groups that benefit from privilege are privileged when privilege is made more visible, but it dramatically alters the experience of privilege. And I think it means that we need new ways of theorizing. Privilege is a concept that comes up all throughout sociology and is kind of shockingly under-theorized as a topic. So I think one way these two things are connected is that there are institutions of privilege that are now just more visible than they used to be.
Robert?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's really a great question. And I like it because it gives me a chance to say something about what I think is the most positive development I've seen in sub-Saharan Africa in the last 20 years. And that is the incredible LGBTQ activism, often by LGBTQ Africans themselves. And these are folks who face extraordinarily high risks for being public and confronting the institution of heterosexuality. And I think the attempt to institutionalize homophobia is about their success in challenging the institution and creating a much needed crisis of African heterosexuality. And so to me, a lot of them have been, it's extremely dangerous work. They're incredibly brave, but they are seen as a threat by people who have extraordinary power. And I think that's a testament to their ability to change the dialogue around heterosexuality as being the African sexual orientation. So yeah.
Okay, Michela, do you want to have the final words?
Absolutely. So yeah, I really appreciate this question because I think as somebody who is also, I also am a scholar who studies children and youth. And we often have this tendency to think that youth are inherently different and have capabilities that are, like different from adults, and we need to protect children and youth. And you see this play out in schools a lot. And some of the questions in the Q&A were also asking about, like a lot of critical race theory and attempts at banning this from being discussed in schools. And the same also applies, I think, like we have these assumptions about what we think is appropriate for kids to learn and what they should not be learning, and why we have all these assumptions about who needs to be protected and why. And this is part of the reason why heteronormativity remains so unchallenged and embedded within schools. For example, a lot of I remember sitting in on students like their Spanish courses, and when they're learning about families, it's like, oh, let's talk about the word for mom, let's talk about the word for dad. And it happens in these really heteronormative ways. And a lot of this just goes completely unchallenged because we think that, there's all of these assumptions about what is normative and what is not. And there's some topics that we then think that young people aren't prepared to encounter. But what we don't realize is that then through this, we end up reproducing a lot of these very systems that end up advantaging people from certain groups more so than others.
Okay, so this comes to time to end our conversation, and I just wanted to thank all the wonderful panelists. It's such a privilege to be here and listen to this really outstanding dialogue. And to those of you who are in the audience, thank you so very much for coming. We would have this recorded video hosted on the website of Cultural Sociology as well as YouTube. Everyone have a great summer ahead, and you're absolutely welcome to contact our panelists to continue the discussion since we cannot address all of your questions. Okay, happy June. Thank you, folks. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jan. That was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for organizing. This was
I
so
think
great.
so. It's actually really great. You just when people get together, then you can like bouncing ideas around. I learned so much. So thank you very much.
Yes, thanks for organizing, Jan. And the noise came back right on time.
How lucky are we? Okay, thank you. You guys enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Take care.
Everybody.
Bye.